have any questions before we start today? No? Okay. So we were talking about the central nervous system. So it's important to realize that the central nervous system not only contains the brain, but is also the spinal cord. So we would say that the spinal cord is part of the CNS. Now, do you remember what opening does the spinal cord exit from your skull? What is that major hole in your bottom of your skull called? Yes, the foramen magnum. So we would say that the spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum. It's going to be difficult today. Okay, so it extends from the foramen magnum to the first or second lumbar vertebrae. So it's very important to realize that it does not extend all the way down the back of the body. And so we actually use that knowledge to decide when we're actually going to manipulate the body and like take out cerebrospinal fluid. We would never do it up high because that might potentially damage the spinal cord. So when you take out cerebrospinal fluid, you do it down low. Okay? So you do it with, which is called, we'll talk about, it's called a lumbar tap. So the other thing about it is that the very end of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris. And then from the conus medullaris, there extends the spinal nerves. And so way down in the lower back of your body, you just have spinal nerves rather than the spinal cord. And those extensions of the spinal nerves are called the cauda equina. So spinal nerves extend down, and these are called the cauda equina. Okay, so what do you think cauda equina means in its root form? What is cauda? Caudal. So if I was going to say something was caudal, you would say that's near the tail, right? So cranial versus caudal, and equina, equine. If you were going to go into equine science, you would study horse, right? So this is literally translates to the horse's tail. Right? And so these are these spinal nerves that extend down through the vertebral foramen, so they're protected by the vertebrae from the end of the spinal cord, which is the conus medullaris. So if we look at a diagram of our spinal cord, you'll notice that it extends down from the cranium, and then here would be the conus medullaris right there. So that no longer contains, so below that, there's no longer the spinal cord, but you can see that there's these spinal nerves that run down, right? And so these are what are referred to as the horse's tail, right? And so the interesting thing is that these spinal nerves are sometimes, they said to be, they're actually racing down through this area, and they actually come out through the foramen in the sacrum. So we talked about the sacral foramina, right? The small pores, holes in the sacrum, and that's where they come through. So remember that the sacrum is just fused vertebrae. And then the very end of the sacrum, you notice that there's really no spinal nerves coming down, except for here you get the first bone of the coccyx. Okay. You'll also notice that there are some enlargements. And so you'll notice that the cervical enlargement, which is located right here, and the lumbar enlargement are due to the fact that there are more neurons in that particular location, because those contain nerves that are serving the upper limb and the lower limb. So the cervical enlargement would be where nerves serve the upper limb, And the lumbar enlargement would be the lower limb. So remember that the spinal cord is a relay for not only motor information going out, but also sensory information coming in. And so sensory information from the hands and such would come in to the area known as the cervical enlargement. Okay. It's also important to realize that the meninges are still intact, right? So we still have dura mater, arachnoid matter, and pia mater associated with the spinal cord. And so if we look at a diagram, this is actually not from your book, we could look at two ways that we might kind of mess medicinally with the spinal cord. The first is called the epidural. And you might have heard of this because this is what they give, typically give women who are in labor, because it decreases the amount of sensation coming from their lower limbs and hence also from the uterus, which can be very painful, right, contractions. And then the moving of the baby out through the birth canal can be really painful. So the epidural, what do you think epi means? Upon. So this is when anesthetics are injected above the dura mater. Okay. Notice that they do it in the lumbar region. Well, we don't want to paralyze the upper limbs, right? But it's actually safer to do in the lumbar region because you can see that these are just the spinal nerves. So if anything happened where you actually punctured the dura mater and went into there, then you're really not going to damage and potentially cause too much damage with the body, okay? So the other thing that we sometimes do when we manipulate the spinal cord is what is called a lumbar tap. Or sometimes this is referred to as a spinal tap. And so notice that this is where we insert a needle and it goes through the dura mater actually into the subarachnoid space. So this is used to obtain CSF from the subarachnoid space. Right. So for example, if they think that you have meningitis, right, they might, which would be an infection of the meninges, they might go in there and they might take a sample to see what it is that is causing that infection. So that is a lumbar tap. And I think I mentioned before that sometimes epidurals go a little bit awry because sometimes they actually cause leaking of the spinal fluid out. They shouldn't, but sometimes they do. And if you leak that out, then you have to put more synthetic spinal fluid, which is called I think it's called a blood patch, back into the central nervous system to get the CSF levels back up. Okay. Are there any questions about that idea? The difference between those two? Okay, so sometimes we can also, have herniations. And so this is actually a picture of, this is a picture of my herniation. Okay. So this is actually L5S1. And you can see here that this is actually an MRI because you can see the soft tissue, right? So here you can see the disc between those two has pushed out. And if you remember, we talked about intervertebral discs as examples of fibrocartilage, and that the nucleus pulposus can sometimes force its way out. And so that is what that is. And so they say that the lumbar herniations are not nearly as bad as cervical herniations because it just causes pressure on the spinal nerves rather than pressure on the spinal cord proper, right? So a lot of people walk around with lumbar herniations, but if they find that you have a cervical herniation, then they typically want to take care of it immediately. So hopefully you don't have to have surgery. And hopefully what will happen is over time, macrophages will come into here and will actually kind of eat away at this. But then you notice that you have an increased space between, this is the most common, L5 and S1. Does it cause you a little pain? Yeah, so this is the primary cause of like sciatica. So people say, oh, I have sciatica. And most people that have sciatica, it has to do with this. Also causes numbness down the legs. And so eventually it will cause what is called foot drop. And foot drop is the inability to, like, if it gets really bad, walking, your foot kind of drags. So you see people walking around with one foot dragging. It could be because of they have a spinal.
If they don't want to remove it.
Actually, they did go in and remove it for me. So they actually had to go in and they took this out. Oftentimes they fused this, but they didn't. They weren't ready for it. They didn't think it was going to be as bad as it actually was. When they went in, they said it was just like dried up foam. That they every time they picked it apart, it just kind of crumbled. And so they just removed that. And so hopefully, actually they said in a few years I'll probably have to have a fusion. So the solution, and this kind of better, the surgeon told me to, as I was coming out of anesthesia, he said, you really need to start doing yoga. Because the idea here is if you build up your abdominal muscles and make them super strong, then you can support the spine and it's less likely that you're going to get another herniation. So keeping yourself with a tight core is really important to protecting your low back from this type of herniation. Okay. So let's look at the cross section. So we can look at cross section of spinal cord. So you need to know these different structures. We looked at them in lab, and one of the interesting things is that the white matter is now on the outside and the gray matter is on the inside. So this is exactly opposite from what we see in the brain and the cerebral hemispheres. So when we look at the gray matter, it has a, oops, yeah, there's two T's there. It has a butterfly-like shape. And so we can call those shapes, those extensions, horns. And so we call the dorsal horn this is associated with sensory function. And then we have the ventral horn, which is associated with motor function. We also have kind of a lateral horn, and the lateral horn is associated with, so the middle, the lateral horn is the smallest, and it is associated with your viscera. So these are the organs that are in your body. So if I was to show you the dorsal horn, it would be located right here. The ventral horn would be located right here, and then the lateral horns would be located right there. We can also see that there is a central canal, and this is filled with spinal fluid. We can also see that when we talked about the vertebrae, remember that the spinal cord travels through the vertebral foramen, and then the spinal nerves exit the spinal cord via the intervertebral foramen. Okay, so the other thing that is interesting, we have here what is referred to as the dorsal root. So this could also contain white matter. And the dorsal root is associated again with sensory, and associated with the dorsal root is we have the dorsal root ganglion. And the ganglion actually contains the cell bodies, or the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. Okay, so coming out, or actually coming in, because the sensory information is coming into the spinal cord, this is what is referred to as the dorsal route. Okay, so it's coming in to the dorsal horn. This right here is the dorsal ganglion. And so remember that the ganglia is actually part of the peripheral nervous system, right? Because in the central nervous system, we have nuclei. So this is actually peripheral nervous system. And then notice that the ventral root coming in does not have the ganglia. So there's no ganglia on the ventral root. Oops, the ventral root, and there's no ganglia. No ganglia. So the dorsal root and the ventral root come together. So they come together to form the spinal nerve. And the spinal nerve itself is very short. It's like 2 centimeters before it branches. Okay. So the dorsal root and the ventral root come together, they converge to form a short little spinal nerve, which is then going to branch into radian. We'll talk about those in a second. So the lateral. Okay. So if we look at this diagram, right, we can see that this right here, those are actually the spinal nerves. And we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves in our body. Okay. So if we go and look at some more cross sections with a little bit different information, remember that these cross sections, they have the matters. And so the outer matter is called the dura mater of the spine, right? So it's connective tissue. Then we have the arachnoid matter. And then under the arachnoid, we have blood vessels traveling, delivering nutrients to the spine. And then we have the pia mater, which is attached right to the surface of the spinal cord. So those 3 layers of meninges are seen here in this cross section. Okay. So I'm going to show you a short little video, and this video is done by the guy who did the Bodyworks? Yeah, Bodyworks. And so this guy is a little bit weird in that he's European, he's German, and he is kind of a cross between an anatomist and also kind of a performer. And so he does these live autopsies. And the live autopsies are done on people that have volunteered and have given their bodies for him to do this. But he's also the guy that has done the plastination. So if you've gone to the Bodyworks, like sometimes I think they had it in OMSI, they have it in Seattle, have it in a lot of different places, but that is where they've actually plasticized different body structures. So like, for example, you can see the entire circulatory system alone, separated out from the body, and it's plastic, right? Or you can see they have the opening of the body and all the organs have been plasticized. And so they look more true to life than, say, for example, when we preserve them with formaldehyde. And so this video has him opening up. This is actually the middle of the video, but it has him opening up the brain and talking about the consistency of the brain. And then it has him also having to open up the spinal, the vertebral column to get the spine out. And so I'm gonna just play this for you so you get an idea of what this looks like in an autopsy. Let's see. Hopefully I have sound. Says I do.
We have actually prepared a fromage.
So here's he's actually discussing that the brain
is the same consistency. And when I drop it down here, up to 200 million nerve cells will look like that.
So in an unpreserved brain, that is the consistency of an unpreserved
They don't
brain.
look like much from the outside. I mean, they have a very soft consistency. But internally, it's actually a miracle of organization. The brain is composed of about 10 billion nerve cells. And you can see one or two of these on this rather beautiful micrograph here. This is actually prepared by a technique that only shows about 1 in 50 or 1 in 100 of the nerve cells present within a given volume of brain. These little black dots that you can see here are the nerve cell bodies. The little wiggly lines coming off them are the dendrites and axons, the processes of the nerve cells that ramify throughout the nervous system and interconnect with one another. An individual nerve cell may have up to 10,000 different branches. So you can imagine when you have this number of nerve cells interconnected in this way, that the brain has an astonishingly detailed organization inside. And it's why the brain is so difficult to repair if it gets injured. Fine structure as such, we could hardly hope to intervene. This is a brain which has been preserved by immersing it in a substance called formalin, which firms up its structure. The human brain is a truly remarkable organ. It's no exaggeration to say that it is the most complex object in the known universe. This is the organ through which we see, hear, feel, love, in fact perform all of the functions that we're aware of, and indeed many that we're not aware of. Let me show you very briefly some of the key features of a human brain. It sits in a head like this. The area here towards the side is an area which was first identified as having a speech function in the brain. The area at the back of the brain here is the area that's responsible for processing vision. The area at the front of the brain here is involved in our personalities. The cerebellum, the little brain sitting underneath the brain here, is involved with motor learning and motor coordination. And underneath the brain, you can see the brain stem running down here, which is responsible for a lot of automatic functions of the body, like breathing and circulation. Well, let's show you inside the brain in a little bit more detail now. And we can do this by slicing it open.
I want to slice it professionally. Therefore, I need assistance, and I do this machine you may have seen before. I will now cut the brain in 1 centimeter slice in the frontal plane. It is injected, therefore you see here inside white matter and gray matter. Now I go to 2 centimeters of slice. And it's actually here you see down the spinal cord. So I order it in consecutive order.
The human brain has been studied intensively for over 150 years, and there's still so much about it that we don't know. It's probably worth pointing out 1 or 2 features on these brain slices. First of all, if you look closely here, you can see that there's a rim running around the outside of the cortex and a medulla, a white area in the middle. It's in the cortex that most of the nerve cells are found, whereas the fibers running from them are mainly found in the white matter further in. This band of white matter here running from one side of the brain to the other is known as the corpus callosum, and it's through this that information travels from one cerebral hemisphere to the other. And finally, this area here shows part of the basal ganglia. You can see some white matter running down through it. This is the tract which takes most of the information directing movement from the cortex down to the spinal cord. And it's in this area that a large number of strokes happen. That is, part of the brain dies when its blood supply is interrupted, which is why strokes are so commonly associated with paralysis. Well, let's follow our movement order now from the motor cortex of the brain through the internal capsule and down the spinal cord.
To expose now the spinal cord, I have to open first the spinal vertebral column.
Just while this is happening, we can show you over here on the plastinated model the organisation that you can find at the back of the body. We've already seen the brain We've seen the brain stem coming down from the brain, and the spinal cord is hidden away in the protection of the vertebra, running in a canal right through the middle of the vertebral column. That's what's being exposed now on the dissection specimen.
So what I do now, I flap here the muscles, the so-called erector of the trunk. It is quite thick here. I flap it back. In order to have easy access to the vertebral column to expose the spinal cord. What I have actually to take away are the spinous processes, and for that I have to saw on from both sides.
It's often thought that the spinal cord is just a connecting trunk between the brain and the peripheral nerves, which take the nerve impulses out to the limbs and the rest of the body. But in fact, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and an impressive amount of processing of the descending motor impulses that help you move actually happens within the spinal column, within the spinal cord itself.
Well, these are the spinal processes which we don't need now anymore. And they are just covering up here the spinal cord in its dural sac. I will now cut the connection between the brain and the spinal cord here.
Having seen the degree of structure that there is within both the brain and by implication the spinal cord, you can understand why it's so necessary that the spinal cord has to be protected within this bony sheath, because it's a very, very delicate structure with an enormous amount of computing power buried within it.
What I cut off now on both sides, the nerves, which like telephone lines, go to the right and left into the body along the rib cage, to the arms and down to the leg. And from the vertebral canal now, I remove the spinal cord in its dural sac. This is connective tissue, and what I cut off from both sides are the nerve roots which go into the whole body to both sides. So I now have already reached here the lumbar region. Go ahead. Yeah, Marius, would you help? Thank you.
The organisation of the spinal cord preserves a memory of when we used to be much simpler creatures, maybe a worm-like creature. And our body is actually divided into segments with nerves coming off, paired nerves coming off at each level, supplying those segments. The spinal cord is also organised in segments, which gives information out to the various body segments, both the muscles in those body segments and the sensory impulses coming back. The spinal cord, although it's protected within the vertebral canal, is clearly susceptible to injury if the back is injured. And clearly, if a complete transection, that is a complete cut across the spinal cord, occurs, then the individual will be paralysed below that level and will also not be able to feel anything below that level.
But at the point we are now, is the nerves to the leg.
It may just be worth saying that the actual spinal cord finishes higher up in the vertebral canal than people often would think. It actually finishes in the small of the back, and much of the rest of the vertebral canal is occupied by leashes of nerve fibres running down towards the lower limbs.
Which you can very clearly see here, because these are all nerve fibers, you see.
That's right, and we're going to now follow the longest of those down to take us back to our wiggling toes.
Have this, please. So the end, you see it very clearly, the end of the spinal cord is here, and all these are now nerves, and we follow the largest one through the sciatic nerve at the back of the thigh. Therefore, I have to remove now the gluteal muscle.
The spinal cord contains tens of millions of nerve fibers. So every minute of every day, there are tens of millions of signals passing down your spinal cord to connect with motor neurons, which move your muscles, as well as many other tens of millions of sensory impulses coming back towards the brain. It's an amount of computing power that is actually equaled by nothing else that we know.
But I have to remove here also part of the sacrum, because within the sacrum, the plexus runs down. I continue now to take the spinal cord, or better to say, the nerves at the end of the spinal cord out.
The initial little roots that come out of the spinal cord contain either motor movement fibers, those that come out at the front, or sensory fibers, those that come in at the back. But the peripheral nerves, which we're now coming down to, contain both mixed motor and sensory fibers, which is why a nerve injury usually produces both mixed movement and sensory symptoms.
So what I actually removed is the sacrum in parts of the bone. And I must be careful. I cut the nerves on the right side. Here I expose the rectum, the large intestine, from behind. Yes, I got it. Yeah, wonderful. Excellent. Ooh. Yes. So put it all up, please, here. And we are now already down here, the sciatic nerve here, and we go all down. So you see, within the sciatic nerve, you see the different nerve fibers.
If the central nervous system, that is the brain, spinal cord, are the main central processes, the peripheral nerves are the wires that connect these central processes to the muscles. The peripheral nerves take movement signals down to groups of muscles to induce a particular type of movement, and they also take sensory feedback, which allows us to continuously monitor what we're doing.
You follow the nerve down to the toes, cutting off the muscle branches which innervate the muscles of the calf, and take the nerve all out of its bed, all the way down. And now we are already down here at the ankle. So I cut off now the nerve that comes to the last muscles of the toe. And now I take it all out from the top. I take the spinal cord out of the vertebral canal, take it out here, the spinal plexus, sciatic nerve, orbital nerve, and also down to the toe. And I bring it over here, and I need some assistance now. I don't need this machine anymore. Could you bring it away, Nadine and Marius? Thank you, because the nerve is really very long, down to the toe.
Well, let's try and give you an idea of the staggering complexity as well as the real
so we'll
beauty
stop there.
of our nerve fiber network. I'll just come over here to our live model.
The live model. Stop before we get to the live model. So we're going to watch again when he gets to the muscles. We're going to watch the first part of that video, but we'll watch it in lab. Okay. So are there any questions about that?
So when it gets down to like the end of like your pelvic, does it then branch to both legs?
Yes. Yes. So there's branches that go out to both legs. Yeah. Okay, so we can also talk about the pathways that go from the brain out through the spinal cord, and then from the body up through the spinal cord and to the brain. And so we can say that motor pathways are descending, and they involve multiple neurons. So generally there's like 2 neurons associated with this. And they extend from the motor cortex, or extend from the motor cortex. Okay. The sensory follow ascending tracks. So we'll put descending tracks, which are bundles of myelinated neurons. And these usually involve 3 neurons. Right? And these travel to the somatosensory cortex, if we're talking about touch, for example. Okay, so the tracks, remember, are the white matter, and the gray matter would be the cell bodies. And so if we look at an example of this, we can see that the ascending tracks, ascending coming up, generally are associated with like the dorsal part, which makes sense because the sensory root is right here. That's the dorsal root. And then in the red, we see that these are the descending tracks. So those are nerve fibers that are traveling down through the spinal cord. So in your book, they have an example. This is actually an example of an ascending sensory tract. And you don't need to know all the information here, but I just want to point out that if you touch the bottom of your foot, say it's the left foot, then it's going to come up here through the dorsal root, and then it's going to extend up, and it's going to travel up. So there is 1 neuron, right? And then it goes to 2 neurons, and then it comes up, and then it goes to 3 neurons. So if you traced it, there would be like 3 neurons in a long chain here. And so notice that the touch of the foot would go to this part of the somatosensory, where like if we were talking about the movement of your thumb, which it would travel up, and remember that it crosses over, and then it would go to another part of the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so that's an ascending where we have 3 neurons that are linked together in a chain. And so a descending tract would be where we're sending an impulse and action potential originating in the motor cortex, and it comes down, and notice that it's a long, long, long axon that comes down here, and then it finally crosses over, right? It can cross over to the other side here, and then this one crosses over here, right? And it can go to the skeletal muscles, right? And so there's actually only a chain of 2 neurons, if you discount the interneuron here, of motor neurons that send a signal out to the skeletal muscle. Okay. So we can talk about trauma to the spinal cord, and we can also talk about disorders. And so one trauma would obviously be if you were to sever the spinal cord, like in an accident. If it is near the neck region, so the cervical region, then you would have a problem with quadriplegia. Right? And so this would be paralysis of all 4 appendages. So think quad means 4. If it is down in the thoracic lumbar region, and I can't remember where the cutoff is, let's see if I can find my notes here. if it's near, if paralysis occurs between T1 and L1, then the lower limbs are affected. So T1 to L1. And so this would be paraplegia. So that would just be half, right? So half paraplegics, right, would have the inability to use their lower legs, but they would still have use of their arms. Okay. So we can also have some disorders. So for example, if you have damage to the ventral root, this is what is called flaccid paralysis. So remember that the ventral root is what carries the motor neurons out. And we actually get a vaccination for a virus that specifically targets the ventral root of our nerve cord. So what vaccination do you think would prevent this type of damage to the spinal cord? Which vaccination do you get? Polio, excellent. Okay, so poliomyelitis. Right? So this causes flaccid, which means that there's no motor tone, right? So there's not motor contraction. And so if you have, this is caused by a virus, right? And the virus goes in and it damages the ventral root. And so we had a president. Which president was that? I can't remember. One of our presidents was in a wheelchair because of polio. Yeah, FDR. And so there's another type of paralysis that is actually due to the damage to the motor cortex. Okay, so this is actually not technically spinal cord, but they talk about it in your book. So this is the damage to the motor cortex. And this can cause spastic paralysis. So this is where we get jerky movements and we get contraction of the muscles. So what genetic, not genetic, it would be genetic, but it's what birth defect or disorder is caused by in utero, so the baby has damage to the motor cortex, so they're born with a disease that does not get worse as a person ages. It tends to stay the same. Yes, and so this is cerebral palsy.
My cousin Nicholas was 19. He was born with cerebral.
Yep. So that is actually not, is that how you spell that? That is actually not due to, I don't think there's a E in there. So cerebral palsy, so that's actually not damage to the actual spinal cord, but it causes a type of paralysis, spastic paralysis. Okay. And then we have a disorder like ALS, which is a myotrophic lateral sclerosis. So this is ALS. This is also sometimes called Lou Gehrig's disease because of the famous baseball player that got it. And this has possible genetic components. We don't really know what causes it. Sometimes it's environmental. Seems to be like the environment turns on the genes. And this is also leads to paralysis by damaging the ventral root. So this is progressive damage to ventral root. And it is a terminal illness. So people typically die within 5 years of getting a myotrophic lateral sclerosis. Okay. So next we're going to start with the peripheral nervous system. So this is abbreviated as PNS. So the peripheral nervous system includes nerves. this would be the nerves. So technically, the spinal nerves are in the PNS. So these would be like the sensory neurons, the sensory nerves, and the motor nerves. Sometimes we have mixed nerves, and they actually talked about that on the video. So the mixed nerves have both sensory and motor fibers in them. The interesting thing about a nerve is that it is actually an organ. So that it has different tissues associated with it. It has its own blood supply, for example. Okay, so it's not just, a nerve is not just a group of myelinated axons, that's the majority of it, but it also would contain a connective tissue sheath, and it also contains blood vessels, and there's actually nerves that supply the nerves. And so if we kind of look at a diagram here, oops, oh, where's my picture I wanted to show? Oh, sorry, I don't know where I had a picture. So in your book, there's a picture that shows the nerve, what a nerve looks like. Okay, so just realize that a nerve is an organ. Okay, so we're going to talk about sensory receptors, and sensory receptors are modified neurons. That are able to absorb stimuli and convert that stimuli into an action potential. So one that we looked at, which we actually don't know a whole lot, but we looked at it in lab, which were the thermoreceptors, right? And temperature is just molecular movement. So the hotter something gets, the more the molecules move. And we actually have receptors on our skin and in our body that can detect molecular movement and then turn that information into an action potential and send it to our brain so that we can perceive hot, right? And so it's kind of amazing that we have all these different types of stimuli. So the sensory receptors can be classified as to where they are located. So we'll just say classification. This says classification. The one is location. Okay, so we have on the surface of our body, we have what are called exteroceptors. Exteroceptors. And these are external stimuli. So these are the ones that we're most associated with, but we also have interoceptors, which are internal stimuli. Now there's a special type of interoceptor that is called a proprioceptor. And these are in our joints and our muscles. And also in our tendons and our ligaments, which we're going to talk about. But the proprioceptors just give us information about like muscle stretch, tendon stretch, right? The location or the orientation of your bones to one another. If you were to close your eyes, you can tell whether your arm is raised or whether it's down by your side. Right? So proprioception is just a special type of an interoceptor. Okay, so we can also talk about these stimuli. So it can be classed as location, but also stimuli. And so we have what are called, chemoreceptors. okay? So chemoreceptors can be both exteroceptors and interoreceptors, right? So they could be both of those because we have chemical receptors inside of our body, but we are also able to taste and we're able to smell. So this is where the binding of a chemical causes an action potential to occur. We are able to tell internally what our glucose levels are, right? Because of chemoreceptors inside our body. We also have mechanoreceptors. And mechanoreceptors are mechanical energy. So physical deformation causes an action potential to be produced. So I'll just put causes an action potential to occur. So when we talk about our touch receptors, our deep touch receptors are like these little encapsulated, like spongy little balls, right? And so when we press down on them, that physical change in their structure actually causes an action potential to be generated. We also have mechanoreceptors in our ear because it's the sound waves traveling into our inner ear that cause the bending of cilia, and then that causes an action potential to be sent to our auditory cortex. And so mechanoreceptors, an example of an interoceptor that's a mechanoreceptor, which would be a baroreceptor. So this is just an example. What's a baroreceptor? We talked about this last quarter. What does a barometer measure? Pressure, right? So this measures blood pressure. So if your blood pressure gets too high, baroreceptors will sense that and it'll cause vasodilation to occur to lower blood pressure. Okay, so that's an example of a receptor inside our blood vessels that detect blood pressure. Okay. So we also have what are called photoreceptors. And these absorb light energy. And we're going to talk about this in great detail. You might have heard of the rods and the cones in our retina are the photoreceptors, but I'm not going to talk too much about it now. And then we also talked about thermoreceptors. The hot, or remember we have actually, we actually have warm and cold receptors that are different that measure molecular movement. So this is molecular movement. And then we have a special type called nociceptors. And does anybody know what nociceptors do? Pain, right? So they detect damage and they are associated with pain. Part of that is probably chemical. So nociceptors could be chemoreceptors because when you damage your tissues, oftentimes they release, the tissues will release structures like, or chemicals like bradykinin, and bradykinin can bind to the nociceptors, but this is pain. And so we have a special type of nociceptor. And then we also have itch receptors. And we just recently discovered those itch receptors. They could also be maybe chemical, but they actually respond to kind of irritation. So actually, I'm not sure what they do. And also probably histamine. So histamine release will make it itchy, right? Actually, I'm not quite sure what to put as my stimulus on that one. Itchiness. Something crawling on your skin. So it could be mechano, but it could also be like something bites you and inflammation causes it to itch, right? And you want to itch it. Okay. Okay, so let's look at some examples. Remember, we talked about the importance of the somatosensory cortex and how it has a map of your body inside of it, right? So different parts of the motor cortex can send out information. Same thing with the sensory, right? We'll go through here. Okay, So the same thing with sensory. Oh, this is the same one. This is the motor. Looking for sensory. So there's another one in your book that shows the sensory. Oh, is this sensory? This is it. Sorry. I'm kind of all on cold meds. Okay, so from the skin, right, sends it up to from the muscles, that sends it up to the motor, or not the motor cortex, the somatosensory cortex, and then from the joints. Okay. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is what is called referred pain. And referred pain is really interesting, I think. This means that internal pain in your organs, sometimes feels like it is pain on the surface of your body. Okay, so visceral pain is perceived as pain on the surface of your body, like pain on the skin, on the surface of the skin. And one of the reasons for this is that these neurons is believed to be, and they know that this, is that the neurons travel the same path. So sensory neurons travel the same path. So they're coming into the ventral root. And sometimes when one is sending an action potential, it seems to be that it can cause or initiate a sensation of pain in another part of the body. Okay, so we have a map. And it looks like something like this. Okay, so this is why you're like, oh, when a person has a heart attack, the right side, right, starts to hurt, right? So your right side, the heart is all down. That's not the right, is it? Is that the right? It's the left. Sorry, the left, not the right side. It's the left side of the body. So it's all down the left side of the body, right? Appendix makes sense and the gallbladder makes sense because it's right over, right, those areas, right? Ureters, if you have damage to your ureters, you might feel it in between your thighs, right? The kidneys, they're showing here kind of down the back of the body, right? Liver is up high. Lungs and diaphragm are right here near the neck, right? The gallbladder is interesting. Okay, sometimes it makes you think that you have pain here in your shoulder. That's the gallbladder. So that's what is referred to as referred pain. So damage internally. So like your appendix ruptures, this is where you're going to sense it. You have a heart attack, this is where you're going to sense it, right? You have a gallbladder issue, these are places where you'll sense it on the surface of the skin. Okay, so we'll stop there for today, and we're going to talk about cranial nerves in lab. So you might want to review the cranial nerves or just look at them, kind of just read a little bit ahead about what cranial nerves are. And we're going to talk about the different cranial nerves. And we might I think we're going to do reflexes. And so for lab, if you could wear pants that you could lift up so that you can put an electrode on your leg. And some people like, oh, you needed to tell me because I needed to shave my legs, right? But you don't have to shave your legs, okay? So don't feel obligated to shave your legs, okay? But you need to have pants that you can lift up, or a skirt or shorts or something like that. Your leg. Shave legs, right?
This is our experiment.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she likes to do all this stuff.
She likes
Do I like it? I would say like
I do the dissecting, she does the acting stuff.
I remember when you did I had to do that last year. I mean, I don't think I get volunteer for everything.
I have a question for you. I remember like in junior high,